The goal of this video is to introduce the Lacanian ideas of desire, enjoyment, or jouissance in French, and fundamental fantasy, and apply the concepts to understand the logic of right-wing politics through the ideas of racist enjoyment and the disavowal of contradiction. Understanding social dynamics of power is important, but as I hope to articulate, to quote Sheldon George, race functions not only at the social level, but also at the psychic. This video will draw predominantly on the work of Todd McGowan and Sheldon George in relation to their writing on Lacan and Hegel. In his talk Fantasizing Race, which there will be a link to in the description of the YouTube video recording of it, Todd McGowan begins with reference to a philosopher of the German idealist movement, Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte discusses a concept called Anstas, which can be understood as an object that is both an obstacle and an impetus to act. This helps us understand the circuitous nature of a fantasy in general. If you're lost in a daydream during a boring class, the daydream can't just get to the end and finish immediately because the detour, that is, the fantasy and the path it takes, is what gives the very fantasy its purpose. A great example of this is the celebrity crush. A celebrity is untouchable, so far removed from the accessibility of the average person, but that very obstacle is also what makes them so attractive. If the celebrity were not inaccessible, they would not have that sublime desirability that comes along with the inaccessibility. Thus, the obstacle of inaccessibility is the impetus that causes them to become desirable. In other words, the obstacle is the condition of possibility for enjoyment. Now, let's make a clarification of terms between enjoyment and pleasure. And to do this, it would be good to refresh ourselves on Lacan's theorization of desire. The anstos, the object that is an obstacle and impetus, takes a different name in Lacan's work, known as petit objet A, or the object cause of desire. This object occupies a structural position. It is not a specific object that we consciously want, like a new car, but it is a position that a specific object, such as that new car, can occupy in relation to our subjectivity. The reason it is called an object cause of desire is because when it occupies that structural position, it is what is causing us to desire, even if it is not necessarily that individual object. In the same way that the obstacle to the celebrity imbues them with a desirable quality, a process that Lacan calls sublimation, any object that occupies this position is sublimated insofar as it is unreachable. But what happens when someone acquires this lost object? Once it is no longer lost, it is also no longer sublime. And as such, the subject simply moves on to desire the next object that fills the role that the former object once did. But in the wake of desire's frustration, the drive is satisfied and enjoyment is produced. The drive is what facilitates the satisfaction we get when our desire is inevitably frustrated, and it's why we desire things in the first place, despite never actually achieving the impossible objet A and getting that object cause of desire. A great example of this operating is buyer's remorse. When you buy a fancy new car and immediately feel regret, that kick in the gut is the twofold operation of you feeling displeasure that the object was not all that you made it out to be, and the enjoyment of the suffering. Lacan's point is that without that element of buyer's remorse, the obstacle to our pleasure, we wouldn't desire the pleasure of the car in the first place. As McGowan elaborates on in Fantasizing Race, the fantasy of the racist in relation to the racial other is not conceived strictly in a sense of social power or superiority over the other. Rather, the racial other is both stronger and weaker than the racist subject. Stronger in that they are more cunning and they have secured a path towards enjoyment that is inhibited to the racist, but weaker in that they don't deserve the access to the enjoyment that they have found and that the racist has had stolen from themselves. In this way, the enjoyment of the racial other is turned into an anstos, an obstacle because of their evil powers that allowed them to access this enjoyment that's prohibited from the racist, but also an impetus because they are inferior, which means that they deserve to not have access to that enjoyment. The racist does. And this is what compels the racist to act. An example of how this fantasy justifies violence that Sheldon George talks about in Trauma and Race is the murder of Jordan Davis, a 17-year-old African-American boy, at the hands of Michael Dunn. To quote Sheldon George, though Dunn's disciplinary actions are addressed to black males, he speaks in a moralistic vein, more acceptable even to African Americans about cultural vices. Dunn argues, I'm not really prejudiced against race, But I have no use for certain cultures. This gangster rap, ghetto-talking thug culture that certain segments of society flock to is intolerable. They espouse violence and disrespect towards women. Our ability to recognize the problematic relation between rap music and the glorification of violence lends support to Dunn's suggestions that his actions are not racist. But what Dunn's remarks express is a hatred directed at rap music as a source of enjoyment, or jouissance, that has come to be identified with Black Americans more broadly. Dunn takes part in a contemporary discourse that binds difference not to the body, but to jouissance. And this helps conceptualize the other instances of racist violence, such as the commonplace police brutality in the United States and the swath of people who defend the officers for just doing their job, or because the victim was a criminal. The black victim is binded to a conception of enjoyment that is inaccessible to the racist, because this enjoyment is one where the black person has acquired objet and is able to do what the racist is not. It seems unfair that the racial other has access to the enjoyment they cannot have. But ironically, this very leveling of the playing field, in which the enjoyment of the other is curtailed, is the very anstos, the object of desire for the racist, a project that will always need to be there in order for them to get enjoyment, but never will be finished. There will always be another thug culture or particular issue for them to despise, but the structural relationship must be sustained in order for them to access enjoyment. To understand the racist enjoyment that's derived from this fantasy structure and how to undermine it, we need to get to an important Hegelian distinction. Hegel distinguishes between contradiction and difference, and he argues that all things are subject to contradiction. That is, in the very identity of something, its otherness is necessarily included. But right-wing politics tries to take what is contradictory and turn that into pure difference. One way that this happens is through patriarchal ideology and the positing of what the role of the woman is. Todd McGowan notes in Emancipation After Hegel, feminist thinkers constantly pointed to the contradictory status of women in the patriarchal world. By drawing attention to the actual situation of women, they revealed that their existence itself was contradictory, and they were able to think this contradiction. He continues, in The Dialectic of Sex, Shulamith Firestone points out that patriarchal society forces women to place their economic and social hopes in winning the love of a man, and at the same time condemns women for adopting a calculating attitude toward love. Women must truly love and must be calculating. They must be innocent and coquettish. Despite the fact that these two positions contradict each other, women take up both. On these accounts, women are contradictory beings, and yet they are actual. As long as we remain within the patriarchal standpoint, the loving woman and the calculating woman have to be distinct subjects, but feminist theory reveals that what patriarchal ideology passes off as difference is actually contradiction, the identity of opposites within the same subject. And herein lies the necessary political response to the logic of difference, to accept and embrace the actuality of contradiction. Donald Trump and right-wing rhetoric about immigration provides another instructive example. For Trump, the immigrant is both strong and cunning because they're coming to the US and stealing all the jobs, but weak and inferior because they're lazy and don't deserve said jobs that they're stealing. But the Hegelian response is to say, yes, contradiction is actual. That is, yes, immigrants are sometimes lazy and they are also taking some jobs, but aren't we all? To undermine this bigoted fantasy structure, one needs to recognize that everyone is subject to contradiction. To quote McGowan again, inequality has its basis in the reduction of contradiction to difference. The authority of those who propagate inegalitarian relations depends on their ability to sustain the illusion that their identity does not suffer from contradiction. The bigot gets enjoyment from a position in which, because they are non-contradictory, they are prevented from enjoying in the same way that the other is, but in the recognition that all subjects are contradictory, and that the other doesn't have access to some hidden transgressive enjoyment, we undermine the structure of fantasy that allows the bigot to disavow the enjoyment they derive from their contradictory subjectivity. Thanks for watching. If this video was interesting, you can check out the previous one on this channel, as the discussion of ideology that occurs in that video complements the discussion of fantasy that happens in this one quite nicely. Throw any thoughts, questions, or concerns in the comments down below, and if you derived enjoyment from this video, drop a like or subscribe for more. Thanks.